No, no.
Oh, you don't want to give old people the money?
No.
I thought you just said you did want to give them the money.
Old working class people.
And I'll be showing what bang you get for your buck. The cost to you, a mere £5 billion. We'll find out who forks out the most in tax and explore the bizarre way the system actually works.
They have VAT, but they don't have VAT, but that's not a biscuit, it's a cake.
It's as clear as mud, isn't it? It really, really is.
I'll be finding out why spending's set to keep rising.
Well, there's not many people coming to you saying, here's what we can stop doing. There's an awful lot of people queuing up outside your door saying, here's what we can start doing. Here's somewhere else to spend our money.
And how politicians keep getting into tangles over tax.
Talking about tax and politics is a bit like talking about sex in public. You know, everybody knows it's their own, but, you know, they don't like to talk about it.
We'll be discovering why politicians keep fooling themselves that the economy will always be plain sailing.
But what we amateur sailors have to know is it can all change incredibly fast.
Right now, we're facing the biggest spending squeeze since the Second World War. Tonight, we find out how on earth we got here.
If you've ever wondered how politicians spend your money, or why they spend it in the way they do, follow me. We'll find out. Woo!
I'm on a mission to get us talking about how we spend. And where better to start than one of Britain's shopping temples, Manchester's Trafford Centre. I've got something in my briefcase, which means I've had to borrow a security guard. It's full of your money. That's right, yours.
This is how much the government spends on behalf of every family each year.
£20.
About £20.
£20? Well, how much do you reckon?
Hi, I've got something for you here.
Oh, yeah.
This is for you, your money.
Lovely.
Yeah, how much is there?
£4,000.
5,000? 10,000? 20,000.
£22,000, that's yours.
Oh, lovely.
It's a lot of money.
Oh, I know. Taxpayers' money.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Is that a bit tempting? Sorry.
It's nice.
Am I just making you think, I like that? You spend it well?
I wouldn't say so, no.
Why not?
Because we don't really see very much of it. It will definitely help in my life.
Actually, you know what? It wouldn't. It's all fake, I'm afraid.
I'll still take it.
You see, while we all hear a lot about cuts, we don't have a clear idea about what the government actually spends on us. So let's start with that £22,000 I've been hawking around. Where does it all go?
Add all those £22,000 up together, and you get a pretty eye-watering amount, £692 billion. Now, there are 7 big budgets which make up more than 3/4 of all government spending. Let's have a look at them. There's transport, law and order, defence, and at the moment, bigger than them all, debt interest. But the 3 really big ones are these. Education, that's about £2,800 per family. In total, over £90 billion. Health, that's about £3,800 per family, or in total about £121 billion. And then social security, the whopper, £194 billion. For every family, that's just over £6,000. That, of course, isn't just benefits for the unemployed or the disabled, but the big pension bill as well.
Now let's ignore the deficit for a moment. The big problem facing politicians long term is that those big bills just keep rising. This is Spitalfields Market in London, where once a month pensioners gather for a tea dance. Many here are over 80, glorious proof that we're living longer, often healthier lives, but ones, let's face it, with higher bills attached. First things first, though. Could I make it onto Strictly?
I haven't a clue where I'm going. You're very good at leading.
In 1901, there were just 60,000 people aged 85 or over.
You can't, you just know it in your head.
Now, there are 1.5 million, 25 times as many. And that figure is set to double in the next 20 years. There'll be 3 million over 85-year-olds.
Am I learning?
What we're all learning is just how expensive that will be.
Getting there, you're getting the rhythm.
I can now feel the rhythm. I'm not sure what I'm doing with my... Oh, you're right. Sorry, my fault.
In 50 years' time, we're forecast to be spending £80 billion more each year just to cope with our ageing population. That's more than double the defence budget.
If you had to hold up one of those things like they do on Strictly, my dancing.
You can't come.
No.
Oh, don't say that.
No.
I didn't tread on your toes too often.
No, you didn't tread on my toes at all.
Oh.
You were a perfect gentleman.
Thank you very much. There are so many people living to a good age. Do you ever think, where's the money going to come from to pay for all of it?
No, don't worry about that, because I'll be 6 foot under by then.
It's my problem, you mean?
No, I think our
Well,
children have that worry, not us.
It's going to get a bit more pricey, isn't it, with so many people living older?
Yes, it certainly is. But I'm not that anxious to go anywhere yet. I'm going to hang on as long as possible, and I hope everybody else does. Mind you, we've worked a lot of years, and we've paid in a lot of years.
Yeah.
All of us.
Even if you dance as badly as I do, you leave the tea dance at Spitalfields feeling pretty good. It's a celebration of growing older instead of people moping about it. And yet, as politicians try to keep in step with our ever-ageing population, they find themselves getting into a tangle too.
You see, politicians find it very hard to cut back on spending on the elderly. So let me tell you a story. It's about winter fuel allowance, a new benefit introduced by Labour in 1997 at a cost of £268 million in today's money.
The winter fuel allowance, when it was introduced, was intended as just a little bit of extra help, £20 a year, for every pensioner, regardless of how well off they were. But that was soon to change when Gordon Brown was accused of being a miser, when he introduced an increase in the weekly pension of just 75 pence. The fury that produced confirmed what every politician knows. There is nothing so terrifying as a pensioner who feels wrong. Tony Blair even dubbed them like Rottweilers on speed.
Britain's pensioners went into battle over the 75p rise.
Oh, it was an insult, wasn't it? Absolute insult to us, all of us.
Nora Knight was so angry about this year's 75p pension rise that she sent it back in the form of a cheque to Gordon Brown. Then, to add insult to injury, she was astounded to find the Treasury had cashed her cheque.
And when pensioners start hijacking buses, you know you're in trouble. The then Chancellor, Gordon Brown, decided to throw money at the problem. And winter fuel allowance went up.
The winter allowance is currently paid to all 8 million elderly households at £20. I've decided to raise it to £100.
And up.
It will be paid not at £150, but at £200 for every pensioner household.
And up.
For this year, for those over 70, on top of the winter fuel payment, we will pay an additional £100 to each household.
So, by 2004, the cost had risen to £2.3 billion, 8 times more than it originally cost. With fuel bills rising, you might say, why not? But can we really afford to keep giving it to everyone, no matter how rich they are?
I've got 200 quid here.
OK.
Right, and I want to know, is it a good idea that the government gives £200 to old people for winter fuel allowance? Is that a good idea?
Old people, they should be really prioritised because they don't work.
Yeah.
And pension is not really a good rate, so...
So give them this money?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So do you want to give her the money?
Actually, no. No.
Oh, you don't want to give old people the money?
No.
I thought you just said you did want to give them the money.
Old working class people.
How about him?
Definitely not.
No, don't give him the money, him?
No way. These people are, like, very, you know, wealthy.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Definitely a good idea, OK.
Yeah. He
So, should he get the £200?
Oh, I suppose it has to be means tested, I suppose.
Oh, what about her?
No.
Or him?
I think they're quite well off.
So they shouldn't get the £200?
No, I suppose when you put it like that, no.
So we like the idea of spending on the elderly, but we're not so sure about handouts to those who don't need them. And some wealthy pensioners agree, like nightclub impresario Peter Stringfellow, a man so outraged at getting the money, he went to the trouble of trying to send it back.
She's the big lady herself.
So, Peter, you're 70.
71st year.
Not short of a bob or two.
No.
More than one house?
2.
More than one nightclub?
3.
Pay yourself enough to earn top-rate tax?
Not too short of £500,000 a year.
£500,000 a year. So how important is getting £200 a year from the government for it to you?
It's embarrassing to me. I don't ask for it. I don't expect it. It was not something that I knew was going to come along.
You wanted the government to give you the chance to say no?
Yes, I did. And then eventually I got a letter back from them saying you will not be receiving it in future. However, if you change your mind, please let us know and then we'll reinstate it. That's not what I wanted. I wanted them to change the whole policy of not giving it to people who don't need it.
I think the problem with winter fuel allowance, it's indiscriminate. It's not targeted. It's not means tested. So you're actually giving, you know, a reasonably significant amount of money overall to people who didn't need it.
Why did it happen then?
It happened because we have a great sympathy for the elderly. We wanted and were pledged to create dignity for people in their old age.
You were in a hole as a government, were you? You'd increased the pension by 75p.
We had also shot ourselves in the foot 1 year by giving a very modest increase in the state pension, and there was inevitably a great sort of backlash against that. So there was a bit of politics in this.
A bit of politics which comes at a very high price and doesn't target money on those who need it most. Even those who work closely with Gordon Brown at Number 10 think it's not the best way to spend our money.
If you go and ask Treasury officials, they would love to take away winter fuel allowance. It would be the first thing on their list.
So why hasn't it been cut?
Politics. Because, you know, older people vote more than younger people, they mobilise themselves, they want to defend their benefits. And, you know, it's very, very hard in those circumstances to confront them with the loss of a benefit. And so whatever the mandarins say, whatever the number crunchers say, whatever policy wonks say, it comes down to a political judgment.
I want you to do everything you can to get him elected.
In the dying hours of last year's general election campaign, David Cameron had to make exactly that judgment. Labour's election supremos were targeting him, claiming he'd axe benefits for the elderly. The question was, how would he react?
What are you going to get?
David Cameron's whole strategy in changing the face of the Conservative Party was to say we're caring. So it's very difficult for them to repeal measures like the winter fuel allowance, because you can imagine not only we as an opposition but many others would come down on them like a ton of bricks.
And let me say very clearly to pensioners, if you have a Conservative government, your winter fuel allowance, your bus pass, your pension credit, your free TV licence, all these things are safe. You can read my lips, that is a promise from my heart.
Ask you a personal question. Do you get the winter fuel allowance?
I still get the winter fuel allowance. I have a government car, so I don't get value for money out of my pensioner's bus pass, but I regard them as tax rebates.
Is it sensible giving people with a reasonable amount of money tax-free sums?
I think we have to demonstrate our commitment to pensioners, and it's a message to pensioners that the government does have regard to the fact that pensioners are entitled to various benefits, and we discussed it before the election. We announced we were before the election. It's an election promise we're keeping.
The reason that first Labour and then Conservative ministers carried on spending billions of pounds on a policy they got doubts about is because they saw it as a powerful political symbol of how much they cared about the elderly. The money that's still being spent on the winter fuel allowance is not far short of the amount that's been cut from the university budget, forcing the trebling of tuition fees. Students may protest, they may even riot, but politicians are much more scared of their grannies. And if politicians daren't mess with spending on the elderly, just imagine how wary they are of touching the biggest sacred cow of them all, the NHS. It all goes back to a summer's day just after the war, in a suburb just outside Manchester.
It's been big, bold decisions to do things together that have really driven up public spending. A little over 60 years ago, here at the Trafford General Hospital, the then Minister of Health, Aneurin Bevan, launched the NHS. It gave Britain, he said, the moral leadership of the world. It also gave Britain a mighty big bill.
Nye Bevan and the other founders of the NHS thought we'd all get healthier, so demand would fall. In fact, spending on the health service has catapulted from £11 billion in today's money to 11 times that much now, £121 billion.
One of the things that people often missed was the way in which the demand to spend money would grow, particularly because we're so much better off than we used to be. In 1955, we spent 3% of national income on the health service. Now we spend nearly 9%. And there's been a steady growth year after year, decade after decade, an extra 1% of national income each decade. And after a little while, those 1% of national income add up to an awful lot of money.
Ever since that day here in Trafford in 1948, the NHS has been so much more than a way of merely organising healthcare. It's been a love affair. It's been, if you like, the closest this country gets to a national religion. And politicians know, therefore, they have to keep on paying to keep the faith.
It's very expensive. And all wealthy states spend an ever higher proportion of their wealth on healthcare. Even if you're running it with iron discipline, it will cost you more health. There's no other area at all of public spending that's like that.
In Canada, when they had a huge deficit, this is what they did. 2, 1, fire! That used to be a hospital. Can you imagine them blowing one up here in Britain? Health's sacred status with us voters means our politicians wouldn't dare. Not that they wouldn't want to. For years, the medical advice to them has been that having fewer hospitals would save money which could be better spent. And that's not all.
Closing hospitals is quite definitely a way to get better healthcare, particularly now with new drugs, with new technology, and you can do cataract operation, you can do in a local GP surgery. No one goes and stays in hospital to the degree they did.
But there's one thing that stops that happening. It's you and me. This is the King George Hospital in Ilford, east of London. Local NHS bosses want to shut its maternity and A&E units and move them to a hospital in Romford, a few miles up the road. But in a local church hall, residents are gathering to fight the proposals.
It's massive. It's a really big issue. Everyone sees it as a money-saving exercise. Saving money first, giving good health service second. That's the crux of the matter, really.
I'm not going to say economical with the truth. They told us it's nothing to do about money. Well, of course it was to do about money.
34,000 residents have signed a petition against closing parts of King George Hospital. Many of us like our services local, and we want to keep them that way.
But the first proposals they came up with...
And so do the local MPs. Labour and Tories are united in backing this campaign.
And if we keep together, we keep up the campaign, we will succeed.
In opposition, David Cameron promised a bare-knuckle fight to save district hospitals.
I think it's ridiculous that at a time when the population is growing, when more people are presenting at accident and emergency units, when actually there are more babies being born, when our health needs are getting greater, that we're shutting down maternity units and accident and emergency units. The government has said that the days of the District General Hospital are over. I completely disagree.
But now he's in government, David Cameron has, in the last few weeks, approved the closure of A&E and maternity units, not just at King George's, but another London hospital. The decision there has been debated for 17 years. It all takes so long because politicians hate to be seen to close hospitals.
I've lost count of the number of members of Parliament. They'd ask for meetings and they'd say to me, I understand completely why you're doing this. I understand all the clinical arguments and I understand and sympathise with those, but you must understand, publicly I have to take this position.
I have to fight to keep my hospital open.
I have to fight and be seen to fight to keep my hospital open.
So fear of us, the voters, helps to push up spending on the essentials like pensions and health. And then there are all those extra little things that are nice to have, like money for culture and the arts. People used to all go to Margate for fun and frolics at the seaside. As of late, though, this bit of Kent coast has been better known for its deprivation and high rate of unemployment. Yet what's this? A brand new art gallery. It's the new Turner Contemporary, opened earlier this year. A dazzling addition to the seafront, costing £14 million of public money. Its sparse but striking displays have already pulled in over 260,000 visitors. And they've put Margate back on the map. Victoria Pomeroy is the gallery's director.
What a spectacular view it is here. You must at times see the real poverty that there is here. How, in a sense, do you argue to yourself the reason why people in very low-paid jobs should pay their taxes to build what is, in a sense, a real luxury?
I don't see the arts as a luxury. I see the arts as integral to our lives, all of our lives, whoever we are. And I think for me it's really important that everyone can access fantastic arts that make them think in different ways about themselves and the world that they live in.
Isn't this just in the end a bit of fluff?
I don't think this is fluff at all. I think this is serious. We are really ambitious. We want to be part of Margate's history and part of its future. And we feel we can really help and support the wider regeneration and renewal of this area.
But not everyone's so sure. Some locals deeply resent the gallery. Dawn McLaren is a local mum who thinks the money was desperately needed elsewhere.
I've got a son, he's 17. He's about to leave college. He's got no work, no opportunity here whatsoever, and nothing to do.
How do you feel about public money going to that new gallery?
Very angry. Very, very angry.
But around the seafront there are a few new shops and cafes opening up. Just maybe the first signs of long-awaited regeneration. Ian Driver is a local councillor.
I do think if you look at this in the long term, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, it will be creating more jobs and people will feel the benefit of it.
Whether you regard the Turner Contemporary as a glorious gallery that can revive a town or a vast and overpriced seaside shed, it is one symbol of what the surge in public spending in the new Labour years actually paid for. Now, the cost of building it has already been met, but the cost of running it, though far from vast, is yet one more addition to the national accounts.
Art spending for the whole of England is £447 million. A drop in the ocean of public spending, and a lot less than winter fuel allowance. But when it comes to how governments spend your money, it's all the little things that add up.
People are always coming up with innumerable small demands, and they say if this money was used imaginatively, it does an immense amount of political good. And all the time you get people coming and saying, I know money's tight, but could we just spend a little?
Well, there's not many people coming to you saying, here's what we can stop doing. There's an awful lot of people queuing up outside your door saying, here's what we can start doing. Here's somewhere else to spend our money. If that was balanced by, you know, one queue of people saying, let's save money here, and another queue of people saying, well, let's spend it here, it might be a bit easier to be a government minister.
Ministers can expect a headline, a cheer even, when they announce a new way to spend public money. But there's all too often a big and rather expensive gap between their promises and cold, hard reality.
Welcome to the Fire Control Centre for the northeast of England, built to keep us all safer in the event not just of fires but floods and terrorist attacks, using the latest technology, satellites even, to keep track of fire engines. And what's more, we were told it would improve efficiency too. Just one problem, the technology didn't work. The building behind me is empty, at a cost to you of £97,000 a month for the next 24 years. And there are 8 others like it around the country.
The cost, more than England's arts budget. £469 million.
For which you get in return nothing.
It's just the most vivid example of a long list of projects where the original idea sounded good, but which have been hopelessly mismanaged. From the Typhoon jet, which came in £3.5 billion over budget, to the doomed NHS IT project.
It's cost billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, but it doesn't work. The NHS computer...
It cost at least £6 billion and counting.
You should not be afraid, just as you would in your own household or your own business, to say, do we actually need to do this? Is this new exciting project or pilot that we're setting up, is it going to make any difference to the way that people behave or the way in which they live? Now, sometimes, you know, we've not asked those tough questions in a way that we should.
Now, whether it's avoiding waste or controlling the insatiable demand for public services, or deciding what not to do at all, requires, well, self-control.
There are 3 things which I've engaged in which have remarkable lot in common. One of them is bringing up children, another is dieting, which I've also done, and the third is controlling public expenditure. And in each case, an important part of the art or the skill or whatever it is the ability to say no and to stick to it. This is the essence of what the Treasury is about. If the Treasury had a motto, it would be the single word no, and it needs to be.
But the failure of governments to say no has had consequences. They keep spending money they haven't really got. It's how we've ended up with a deficit.
Britain has got a problem, a very big problem. And it's this. Last year, the government raised £549 billion in tax, but spent £692 billion, leaving a deficit or a gap of £143 billion. But now, just take a look at this. Here is government spending since the Second World War. It's measured as a percentage of the economy as a whole, or GDP, gross domestic product. The peaks are recessions, and you can see them here for the mid-70s, for the mid-80s, for the early 90s, and then finally
for the banking crisis of 3 years ago, which helped create the largest deficit since the war. Now, let's add a line for taxes, measured in exactly the same way as a share of the economy. Look how often spending is higher than tax. In other words, how often the economy is in the red, in good or bad times, whether there's a Labour or a Conservative government. Deficits have been the name of the game for pretty much all of the past half-century. Even so, today's deficit is a whopper. It may date from the banking crisis, but the last Labour government had been spending more than it got in taxes for 6 years running up to then. Gordon Brown used to say that he was borrowing to invest, but his critics said he should have been saving for a rainy day.
The reason we keep running up deficits is not just that politicians can't say no. It's that sometimes they behave like every day will be a day when the sun is shining.
It's a mistake that pretty much anybody really could make. Best explained perhaps by something that I like to do, or try to do, when I'm not covering politics.
You see, think of our politicians as sailors. Just like me today, they've got to judge the conditions as they decide how to spend, and keep an eye out for storms on the horizon.
It's beautiful out here on the water, and when economic conditions are this good, no wonder our politicians are tempted to set a course to carry on increasing spending, as if it'll always be this way. After all, the sun is out, the wind is in our sails. But what we amateur sailors have to know is it can all change incredibly fast. And then we're in real trouble.
And that's what our politicians can forget, how fast the weather can turn, how bad the storms can be. And it's not just the last Labour government, because the Tories did it too.
Working for you now, working for you now.
Remember the late 80s? The economy was booming, the city was taking off, and the then Conservative government made a classic mistake. They thought it would go on forever and increase spending.
The mistake they made was that they thought that the tax revenue that was in fact coming from an overheated economy was coming from an economy that was working extraordinarily well. So they thought it would always be there. The analogy would be a naive young adult who thinks that because they've had a fabulous year in their business, it's going to be like that forever. And so they take on much larger liabilities than they really should, and they repent at their leisure.
By the early 90s, the Conservatives had a new Prime Minister. But then came a recession, which pushed spending up and tax revenues down. By 1993, they had a deficit of £50 billion.
We made a mistake in the late 80s. That was a tiny wobble compared with what's happened in the last 5 years, I have to say, a difference of a degree. But it was a bit of the same thing, and it's been done by many countries, done by Britain frequently, ever since the war.
And guess what? Barely 10 years later, the Labour government would make exactly the same mistake, only in Technicolor. After 2 years' restraint, spending roared away.
We had to spend more money as a country because health is a matter of decency, education is a matter of our future. Now, it's sometimes difficult to remember when you look at new hospitals, new schools around the country now that they had to be paid for.
And while the economy boomed and the taxes rolled in, all seemed well.
In the middle of the boom, they misjudged it. The booms produced great tax revenues. Any government could borrow as much money as it liked. People like me or Vince Cable moaning away about deficit and debt were regarded as old-fashioned, miserable, didn't understand new politics, a new economic model.
But the government had missed something crucial about where a hefty chunk of all that money was coming from. Over the last 30 years, the Treasury has benefited from two vast windfalls. Not just North Sea oil, but also the one that people often forget, the City of London generating billions of pounds, which the government can spend. There is, of course, one major difference which the last Labour government was to discover. North Sea oil runs out very slowly, whereas the flow of cash from the city can run out just like that.
The big problem that we had is that we were very dependent on a flow of revenue from one particular source, and that was the financial services industry, a volatile sector that when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. Whenever you're quite dependent on one source, and this is something been building up for decades, then you do have to ask yourself, what if? What if it stops? Or what if it slows down? What's your fallback position?
In the summer of 2008, his what-if moment arrived. The British economy was teetering on the brink of recession. Alistair Darling took top Treasury civil servants away for the day to Dorney Wood, the Chancellor's official country house.
It's an oasis of calm, really, and I wanted us to sit down and take stock. We were sitting in an armchair overlooking these delightful gardens in southern England, and we were talking about this, and the Permanent Secretary said, you know, borrowing could hit £100 billion. When you start talking about £100 billion, you know, that is serious money. That is when you think, yes, this is bad.
Is there an intake of breath?
Well, there was amongst some, I suppose.
Shaky of heads?
From my point, I've just come back from a Leonard Cohen concert, so actually I was quite... I was in quite a gloomy frame of mind anyway, so I thought, okay, fair enough, we'll just have to deal with it.
Dance me to your beauty with a burning violin. Dance me through the panic till I'm gathered safely in.
What had looked like a downturn had become a crash. The deficit would grow much larger than £100 billion, and ministers would spend even more trying to avert disaster.
Spend now and pay later. Labour's plan to avoid a long recession.
The country would soon want to know how it could all be paid for.
What happened when the financial crisis struck is that we knew immediately we had to accelerate out of the storm or be buried in it. The public were quite frightened of those telephone number figures that they saw, you know, on those, you know, BBC News reports at 10 o'clock. And they felt, hold on a moment, you know, we've got to do something about this, otherwise we're going to be saddling future generations with a colossal amount of debt, and that is not the responsible thing to do.
But for many months, Gordon Brown instructed his ministers not to even talk about the drastic measures which were sure to be needed to tackle the deficit.
Gordon's nervousness was that that would just sound like cuts.
He didn't want to use the C word at all, did he, the word cuts?
Well, we had so many discussions about this. I mean, more than I could care to remember, until we got to his TUC speech in September of 2009. And he used the word cuts, not once, not twice. I think it was something like 7 or 8 times.
Labour will cut costs, cut inefficiencies, cut unnecessary programmes, and cut lower priority budgets.
And he came back from Brighton or wherever it was and he said, OK, satisfied?
It was too late. By then, the sheer size of the deficit had damaged Gordon Brown's economic credibility and handed the argument to his enemies.
It was the biggest loss of control over fiscal policy and tax and spending that anybody now living can remember.
By the time of the last general election, Britain had the biggest deficit since the war, £160 billion.
You do need to just keep your eye on how much you are actually spending. You know, the what-if question of what if this slows down, how much margin have you got? But I have to say that, you know, there may have been people around who said spend less, but the majority, and certainly there was a political consensus, maybe that was a bad thing, but certainly a political consensus that we should be spending more, not less.
Not anymore. A new government has ushered in a new age of austerity.
Are the cuts going to hurt, Chancellor?
This is a dramatic change of political and economic strategy, and like the last Chancellor, he can only wait and watch and hope.
We have moved from an era when choices could be avoided to one where they simply have to be made.
The decisions we make will affect every single person in this country. And the effects of those decisions will stay with us for years.
Every day we hear about cuts to pensions, pay, services, all choices about who gets what. But some questions are still considered too explosive to ask. Like, why, if you live in some parts of Britain, you'll get more spent on you than people in other parts? Take Scotland. Public spending is, on average, £10,212 per head, whereas in England it's £8,588. That's a gap of £1,624, just under 20%. So what difference does that extra money make? Well, one possible answer can be found here at Edinburgh University. It's freshers' fare. We can sign up to anything from tribal drumming to pole dancing. However much you pay to come here in tuition fees, which of course depends on where you're from.
I'm Anna and I'm from Yorkshire, and I pay at the moment about £1,700 a year.
I'm Matthew, I'm originally from London and I spend the same, it's about £1,200.
I'm Matt, I'm from Edinburgh and I pay nothing at all.
And looking very pleased.
I'm looking very pleased.
You have to preside over a student body, some of whom are paying and some are not.
Yes, I mean, we have huge conflicts and we have inequalities of fee level, but it shouldn't result in inequalities of educational provision, and that's the thing that we're making sure remains absolutely front line.
And it's not just the difference between Scots and English people.
No, not at all. It's the difference between Scots and English. Also, Europeans still get it for free, even though the English are paying because of the EU. And then we've got international students who are paying through the roof fees to be with us in Edinburgh. So there are huge inequalities in the amount that people are paying, and they're inequalities that I don't believe should exist.
But those inequalities are going to get starker as fees rise. English and Northern Irish students arriving here next year could face a bill up to £36,000 more overall than their Scottish or European friends. Welsh students will pay less than that, but more than the Scots. And tuition fees are just one example of what Scots seem to get which the rest of Britain doesn't. Is that unfair or just a consequence of devolution? What is your message to an English parent who says, my child goes to Edinburgh University, pays £9,000, a Scot doesn't pay that? A Pole doesn't pay that? How's that fair?
Well, I would change the government in Westminster. You see, when I was an MP at Westminster, I voted against the Labour government introducing tuition fees. If I'd still been an MP at Westminster, I would have voted against the Tory and Liberal government introducing it. You know, I cannot dictate the politics of England.
But the parent might say it's my English taxes that are paying for Alex Salmond to dole out money to stop tuition fees in Scotland.
And the Scottish parent might say it's Scottish revenue that's keeping the United Kingdom Treasury afloat.
In other words, North Sea oil. Scots, Alex Salmond is saying, pay more in as well as getting more out, as do, incidentally, people in London. The maths is more complex than it first appears. There is no simple fact when it comes to measuring the difference between spending in Scotland and spending in England. There are arguments about how to measure need, how to take into account geography, and of course our old friend, the contribution of oil revenues. There is no one simple fact about politics in Westminster. For more than 30 years, politicians, Labour and Conservative, haven't dared look again at the numbers. They haven't dared ask the question because they fear the consequences. The amount different nations in the UK get is determined by a formula dreamt up in Whitehall way back in the 1970s. Because it was an issue then, too.
Last year, for each £100 the state spent on every Englishman,
it spent a much larger share, £119 on every Scot.
TV programmes may have changed, but the size of the gap has stayed the same. So why doesn't the Treasury do anything about it.
We haven't looked at how much Scotland gets, Wales gets, England gets, and probably we need to do so. Why haven't we done so over the last 20 or 30 years? Probably because governments have been very frightened about opening up this tin, and what would be a very complex calculation, particularly against a background of independence movements, most notably in Scotland.
Wouldn't a plain speaker call that bribery? We'll give you the money and then you won't vote for independence.
I don't think that they would necessarily call it bribery. They might choose to do so.
I tell you one reason the Treasury aren't keen to reopen this. It's you. They think you're going to make Scotland independent. They think if they look at these figures, that there'll be a break of the Union. They don't want it to happen.
Well, they think if they look at the figures. I was brought up to believe there were three great lies in life. One is the cheques in the post. Second is, darling, I'll respect you in the morning. And the third is, I'm from the London Treasury and I really want to help Scotland. We in Scotland are prepared to raise all our own money and govern all our own spending, with no subsidies from anyone, as long as people in England do exactly the same thing. And if England raises its own money, governs its own spending, Scotland does the same, then that is the essence of a happy relationship in these islands forever and a day.
Westminster politicians may have shied away from some tough choices, but the ones they have made are revealing something else. How dependent some parts of Britain have become in recent years on public spending, and how much they stand to lose now it's being cut. My next stop is Durham. I've come here along with 50,000 other people for one of the North East's great traditions.
The wonderful sights and sounds of the annual Durham Miners' Gala are meant to be much more than merely a celebration of Britain's industrial past. They are meant to be a campaign, a live one, for political causes. And yet what they remind us is how few industrial jobs are left here in the North East, how many depend directly on public spending.
Take the Durham Miners Association brass band. There are still a few ex-miners in it, but more than half are public sector workers. From Kevin, who works in environmental health, to Julie, who's in further education. Since the mines closed in the 80s, governments, first Tory, then Labour, tried to compensate by creating public sector jobs. It did work for a while, but it's left some people here exposed now that spending is being cut. Ian Lavery used to be a miner. He's now a local MP. His constituency covers Morpeth, the town which has more public sector workers than anywhere else in Britain.
Because in my constituency we've got lots and lots, more than 50% of people work in the public sector, and of course we've got more than 50% of women working in the public sector as well.
You're saying more than half your constituents work in the public sector? You must wonder sometimes, there can't be enough money being raised to pay for more than half the people to get jobs that aren't being created through wealth creation.
Well, these jobs are valued jobs. They're jobs that are much needed. I mean, and they've got to be paid for by the public purse. If you want people...
Who pays for that?
The taxpayer.
Who pays for that?
Me, you, everybody else. And who wants the public services? Me, you, and everybody else. We want a good public services. We need to survive. We need good public services.
The problem is that when the money runs out, those public sector jobs go. Unemployment here in the North East is already higher and rising faster than anywhere else. Politicians talk of rebalancing the economy. It's easily said, but for the Durham Miners Association band, you're talking about their livelihoods.
It's not really our fault that those heavy industries have gone. We go where the jobs are, and now the jobs are in the public sector. But for some reason, we're being told now that parasites. We're bleeding the country dry. The spin goes against us. So I don't really know why, but as far as we're concerned, we just want a job to make a living to raise our families.
And for those who lived through the closure of the pits in the 1980s, like one-time colliery worker Julie, painful memories are being stirred.
Does it feel like you're going through it all again? You lost all these jobs in the 80s, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly the same. I mean, I now work in the further education college, and the cutbacks for funding mean that the budgets for next year are going to be much less, and as a result they've got to cut staff.
And does it feel like...
It feels... it's friend against friend going for the same job.
People and communities in Britain have built their lives around politicians' decisions to spend public money. No wonder cutting it hurts. There is, of course, a fierce political debate about the speed and depth of spending cuts and the impact they're having not just on people, but on Britain's stuttering recovery. The government and the opposition may profoundly disagree about that, but they agree that we just might need to dig ourselves out of trouble.
You may well think that they spend your money pouring it into great holes in the ground. Well, you know what? You'd be right. This, though, is no ordinary hole in the ground. It is the largest construction site in Europe. This is going to be the new Canary Wharf station on London's biggest train set, Crossrail. The cost to you, a mere £5 billion.
And that's just a fraction of the overall cost, £14 billion. So why spend such huge sums on infrastructure, rail lines, roads, bridges, at a time when so many in the public sector are losing their jobs? One fervent believer in why infrastructure matters is Crossrail's chairman, Terry Morgan.
We are on this extraordinary site. That's where it will all happen soon, is it?
It does. Late in 2012, we're going to see some tunnel boring machines come out through that circle and will appear in this fantastic new station called Canary Wharf. And sometimes it's very difficult to explain to people, what do you get for 14.8 billion? Well, you get 8 stations like this. You get 20 kilometres of 2 tubes the size that you can see behind you. You get an awful lot of new track, new jobs, new trains, new stations, huge amount of investment that nobody can see.
But I could get nurses, teachers, schools, hospitals, better public sector pensions. Why do I want a bloody great hole in the ground?
Infrastructure investment is a long-term investment. There's a role for schools, role for hospitals. It's a question of how do you get the right balance about short-term decisions and long-term decisions that says we've invested for the future.
In the last recession in the 90s, there were drastic cuts to infrastructure spending. Now on all sides, politicians want to avoid repeating that mistake.
It's so vital that you do keep up the pressure for investment in infrastructure. At its peak, there'll be 14,000 people employed in Crossrail. We've got a Crossrail Academy being constructed, which will train many, many thousands of young people in vital engineering skills. These things generate employment, and employment of all kinds. Unless you invest in the things that are going to deliver long-term growth, you will pay a long-term price.
Few would disagree with that. Investment spending is due to be much higher than in the last recession, but it's still going to be halved over the next 5 years. Even whilst the government protects big projects like Crossrail, many smaller ones have been cancelled.
Whenever politicians run out of cash, it's mighty tempting for them to stop spending on infrastructure for the future so they don't have to cut the spending on people in the here and now. And the reason's pretty obvious if you think about it. Who ever heard of a cancelled bridge? Writing to the paper to complain? Or a road that isn't being built? Calling a radio phone-in? You see, infrastructure may be important, but it doesn't have a vote.
In this film, I've tried to reveal how all too often raw electoral politics can determine how they spend your money. We've seen the impact that that has on ever-rising budgets, for pensions and for health, on where in Britain your money goes, and on how deficits happen. Though the cuts have generated sound and fury, they haven't made us ask the really big questions we now need to ask.
It would be nice to think, though probably naive, that come the next election you could have a sensible discussion about these things. If you want to have top-class education, which we need in the future, if you want a railway system that works, if you want to make sure that there's care for your elderly parents, then at some point, somewhere, it's going to have to be paid for.
We need a more honest debate, because the spending pressures aren't going away.
Politicians need to take us seriously. They need to say to us, look, we do an awful lot of things that you want us to do for you, but those things are things that are costing more and more. You're living longer. There's more that we can do with healthcare. You want better and better education so that we can compete in the world. You want law and order that looks after you, that protects you. You want a defence service that can do what you want us to do in the wider world. Well, you've got to pay for it, and these things are going to get more expensive.
For years, politicians have offered us an impossible mix. Increased spending, but lower taxes at the same time. It's a mix we voters tell them that we want. It's a mix which has helped to contribute to the sort of mess that we're in today. A more grown-up choice would be to say either you've got to do more for yourselves or you're going to have to pay the bill. But as we'll see next time, there's nothing that politicians fear more than telling us our taxes are going up. The rich don't want to pay more.
I think taxes are totally voluntary for the very rich.
The rest of us feel we're taxed enough already.
I feel like we haven't got any more to give.
When politicians try to find other ways to raise tax, they face impossible odds.
If someone can think of a popular tax, then they should phone up and let us know.
Next time on Your Money and How They Spend It, the trouble with tax.
Ian Hislop recalls a time when bankers were good over on BBC Two this evening at 11:20. And coming up next here on BBC HD, we're off for a walk with Julia Bradbury.
Welcome to the street of choices. How much to spend, how much to tax. For years, the occupants of number 10 have claimed they could spend more without taxing us more, leaving the Chancellors in number 11 to balance the books. All too often they've failed. Now we're living with the consequences. In this series, I've been finding out how we got here and examining the demands on the people who have to make the nation's sums add up. Right now, the economy is facing the tightest squeeze in decades, and it hurts. We put pressure on the Chancellor to spend more and more, and then we're incredibly resistant to paying more tax to pay for it. So why can't politicians protect the have-nots by taxing the have-lots? It may not be that simple. Taxes are, for the very rich, effectively voluntary.
I think taxes are totally voluntary for the very rich.
What about those who are not rich, but are certainly better off?
It's not that I don't want to pay anymore, but I feel like we haven't got any more to give.
And why can't they simplify the bewilderingly complex taxes on what we spend and buy?
That one doesn't pay. That one does pay VAT. Why? Don't ask me, I'm not the Chancellor.
Why don't Chancellors tax us enough to pay for all the things that we say we want them to spend money on? Why do the nation's sums fail to add up so often over our history? Tonight, the trouble with tax on your money and how they spend it. let's begin at the beginning. What is tax? We know what it is, don't we? It's the government chasing us for our hard-earned cash.
Are you a taxpayer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Could I have £5? Because there's somebody over here who needs it more than you. I'm just trying to get money off taxpayers to give to some other people. Are you happy to pay a bit more? You probably pay your taxes already, don't you?
I do, mate.
Yeah. Too much?
Too much.
I wondered if I could just have some of your money to give someone who needs it. Would that be all right?
I need it myself.
You need it yourself?
Yeah.
Where am I going to get it from then?
Manchester's full of good people, but giving money to total strangers is perhaps asking a bit much. Though that's what politicians do.
Do you mind, there's somebody in need over there. Could I have £5 to give it to them?
I've just got enough for myself at the minute.
Have you? You don't want to give it to the lady over there?
I can't afford to.
She needs it, she's got children.
I can't afford to, I need it.
And now politicians want us to fork out even more to pay for the country's huge liabilities.
I just need a bit of extra money, is that all right? It's very expensive, the police, we've got to pay for the schools, hospitals, there's a war on. So have you got £5 each maybe, could you?
The governments generally just waste it, don't they?
Yeah.
They just fritter it away on wars and giving it away to idlers who don't work.
Who here can I get to give me some more money, do you think?
People who have more money.
Who are they? What do I have to look for? People in suits? So I'm very sorry to stop you in your lunch break.
Not at all.
Have you got your wallet on you?
Yes.
There are quite a lot of people in need here and a lot of public services need to be paid for. And I wonder if you could just give me some more money for them.
I'm afraid I can't afford it.
No?
I think it's a familiar story you will be hearing.
I don't seem to be able to persuade anybody to part with their hard-earned cash so I can hand it on to somebody else. Which is a bit of a problem for governments, really, because taxes are the way that they take from one and give it to another, maybe even back to us when we're unable to work, or sick, or old. And if a nice guy like me can't do it, imagine how much harder it is for politicians.
Well, the public obviously want to spend money on very worthwhile causes that either affect them or other people. The public also don't want to pay for it. They believe the government can find other people to pay for it.
Talking about tax and politics is a bit like talking about sex in public. You know, everybody knows it's their own, but, you know, they don't like to talk about it too much. And I think people tend to be so cynical now about what government does. It's always going to be a difficult conversation, but, you know, perhaps it's a good time to have it.
A good time because we're living way beyond our means. Last year, the government raised £549 billion in taxes. A huge amount, but much less than they were spending. Stimulating growth is one way to close the gap, but how else could they raise more to make the books add up?
Remember that number? £549 billion, the amount raised in taxes last year? Well, 3 big taxes raised more than 60% of that. The big daddy is income tax. It generated £152 billion. But since politicians have been a little afraid to put the rate up for many years, they've looked instead to another tax on our incomes. It's not called a tax, it's national insurance, and it raised more than most people think, £97 billion last year. The amount raised by VAT, value-added tax, has doubled in the past 30 years. It raised £86 billion. Since then, of course, the rate's gone up. No other taxes raise anything like as much as those 3. Businesses pay in all sorts of different ways. They pick up more than half the bill in national insurance, they pay rates and other taxes, and then there's corporation tax, which generated £43 billion last year. Next comes the little guys, although it probably doesn't feel like that a lot of the time. Add fuel tax, for example, to the so-called sin taxes on booze and fags. Last year the government raised £46 billion. Council tax, which a lot of people don't like, added just £26 billion to the nation's coffers last year. And then there are all those little ones that we like to curse. Stamp duty when you buy a house, £6 billion. Inheritance tax, £3 billion. And you can't even fly away from the problem without paying tax on that plane ticket, £2 billion. So short of inventing an entirely new tax, there are your options.
Instead of deciding which tax should go up, many start by saying who should pay more tax. Their answer's simple. The rich, like this man.
Okay, so we're ready for departure if you are. I'm happy, yeah, thank you very much.
John Caldwell has all the trappings of enormous wealth. A helicopter, a yacht, and a vast mansion.
That feel good looking at that? It's a fabulous house, isn't it? Lovely. I've always loved Jacobean architecture, Elizabethan Jacobean.
Caldwell's a great British success story. His Phones for You mobile phone business created thousands of jobs, and when he sold it, netted him £1.5 billion.
How does a lad from a terraced house with an outdoor loo here in Stoke feel about living in that 50-room mansion a few minutes away? Well, of course I feel lucky and privileged, but by the same time I don't sort of look at it and it takes my breath away, because it sort of took me 35 years to get there.
In some countries, the super rich have asked to pay more tax to help clear their country's debts. Here, billionaires like John Caldwell aren't keen to follow suit.
How much can you tax the rich before they vote with their feet and decide to leave the country, and then the revenue to the exchequer is reduced rather than increased?
And have you got a sense of how much tax you've been paying in the last few years?
I've got a very great sense of the tax I've paid, but I don't know whether you could even stand the number.
Go on.
Well, if we go from what I've already paid since selling the business, and then include what is due and going to be paid, we are definitely talking of around about £280 million.
Caldwell's proud that that sum could pay to build 14 brand new secondary schools. But he doesn't like paying his tax one little bit. You choose to give quite a bit of cash now to charities. Why do you feel better about doing that than paying your tax bill?
Do you know, there's no comparison. I'm sorry. It takes my breath away, to be honest, because we run our charity and all my charitable works like a business, and we make every last penny really count. That is incredibly satisfying, and I do it because I do it voluntarily. It's even more satisfying. What is satisfying about giving 50% of your income to the government and then having it frittered away in many areas that you strongly disagree with?
Few people like taxes, no matter how rich they are. Parliament echoes to the sound of past struggles to prize more from the wallets of the wealthy. The biggest tax of them all was invented specifically to target them. 200 years ago, like today, Britain faced a mighty big bill. The Prime Minister William Pitt decided the rich should stump up. You can blame him for income tax. Its troubled history starts here in the Parliamentary Archive.
So, we're in the original room and the original income taxes right here. This is the original Income Tax Act of 1799.
So if I bin that, I can get rid of having to pay any tax?
I fear it doesn't quite work like that. If I just take it off the shelf.
You can live in hope, can't you?
Indeed.
This is it.
This is it. This is the original.
At the time.
As written out in Parliament while the bill was being passed.
When first introduced, income tax was solely for the wealthy. Those earning over £200 a year would pay 10% of their earnings. Most gracious Sovereign, we, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of Great Britain in Parliament assembled, for granting to His Majesty an aid and contribution for the prosecution of the war. This great act was introduced to deal with what's now a familiar problem, a whopping great budget deficit, but in particular to deal with the costs of war. And because the idea was so unpopular, then as well as now, the writers of this document convinced themselves that it would be temporary. But of course, income tax is still with us. Over the years, more and more people have had to pay it, and time and again when things got tough, politicians turned to the wealthy. Back in 1973, hammering the rich was thought to be a surefire vote winner. Just before an election, Labour's shadow chancellor made this prediction.
I warn you, there are going to be howls of anguish from the 80,000 rich people who are rich enough to pay over 75% on the last slice of their income.
Dennis Healey boasted that he'd squeeze the rich till the pips squeaked. At the Treasury, he went further, raising the top rate of income tax to 83%. It was in fact the Stones, not the Pips, that did the squeaking. They and other celebrities complained bitterly.
Basically, I mean, we have to give all the money to the revenue, bless them. I mean, they should really be promoting the tour. I mean, they're doing very well out of it.
The Rolling Stones could avoid their soaring tax bill by rolling out of Britain, along with Rod Stewart, Michael Caine and countless other wealthy people, leaving Labour to be branded the High Tax Party. By the end of the 70s, a new Tory government came to office promising lower income tax for all. The basic rate was cut to 30%, the top rate to 60%. But it was the next dramatic step which changed everything.
One day, one speech, one budget transformed the politics of tax. It was March the 15th, 1988, when Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, cut not just the basic rate of income tax, but slashed the top rate too. There were cries of shame from within the Commons, but the echoes died remarkably quickly.
A reduction in the top rates of income tax can, over time, result in a higher and not a lower yield to the exchequer.
We had a system of taxation as a result of Labour governments putting up the top rates of income tax and Conservative governments not reducing them again. So we had an absurdly high top rate of income tax, which was having very great ill effects.
Excessive rates of income tax destroy enterprise, encourage avoidance, and drive talent to more hospitable shores overseas. I propose to abolish all the higher rates of income tax above 40%.
There was uproar in the House. It was quite extraordinary. It was, in fact, the only budget there's ever been in which the House of Commons the sitting had to be suspended.
This major reform... Order! Order!
Outrage would soon turn into acceptance. The new lower rates of income tax became politically untouchable. A decade later, New Labour and Tony Blair pledged not to raise income tax, even for the rich.
If we had not capped the top rate, people would have said, you know, this sort of increase in taxation is sort of coming our way, gradually, step by step. It wouldn't end at the relatively very rich. It would start encroaching, you know, on the not so rich and the people who want more.
That, in short, was the dilemma which the last Labour government wrestled with. How do you target the rich to pay more tax without alienating the people who aspire to be rich one day, or indeed everybody else who fears that you might come for them next? In short, how exactly do you decide who are the rich?
It's race day at Newbury in Berkshire, home surely to one or two rich people. I'm certainly not making my fortune, but surely this is just the place to find the people who we all agree should pay more tax, don't we?
Where are the rich? Who are the rich?
I wish I knew. It's not me.
It's not you?
No.
I have come in search of the rich. Who are the rich? Is it you? Is it him?
Yeah.
Who are the rich? Yeah. They're the blokes over there in those boxes.
I would imagine so, yeah. Yeah, they've got a nice life, haven't they?
Yeah. Who are the rich?
Not us.
No?
Not this evening. No, we won't be after this is finished.
Yeah.
No, by the rich, you mean the very rich. That's what he means, not the middle people like us.
No luck then in finding people who think they are rich. So let's try another tag. On a range of pay scales from about 20 grand to £500,000 plus, where does being rich begin?
Where on here would you instinctively think rich begins? There. So where do you think the rich starts then? Is it that one or that?
It's round here.
About there?
Yeah, so I guess you're the top bit. So
Where do I come in?
I think you must be here.
I can break news to you.
Judging by the BBC thing, I guess you're here.
I am absolutely. You are absolutely right. I am on this sheet.
You are on this sheet.
Thank you very much indeed.
I think rich, I hate to tell you, I think it begins round about here.
119,000 a year.
Yeah. There.
119,000. That's rich.
Yeah.
So some agreement about who the rich are, but how many people are that well paid?
How many people earn that sort of money?
Oh, not many. Not many.
About how many?
About 20%.
20% earn more than 120,000?
Yeah.
I would say 10.
10%? 25% of the country earn more than 119,000. Shall I tell you the answer?
Yeah, go on now.
1%.
Oh, is that right?
Only one?
Only 1%.
Is that really?
1% of the country.
Crikey. Is it? What about all the football players?
Well, not many football players, are there?
Oh, well, we're the lucky ones then, aren't we? Mind you, we've probably well worked for it.
Yeah.
So our perspective is all wrong.
Having the wrong perspective has real political impact. When we tell politicians to tax the rich, we mean other people, never us. And we overestimate how many there really are.
There aren't enough rich to fund the sorts of expenditures that need to be funded. I mean, I'm not poor, but I don't regard myself as rich. I regard Russian oligarchs as rich. Everybody has their own idea of who the rich are, and they're always someone else.
And it's them that should pay
and
rather
it's them
than
that
us.
should pay, yes.
At Westminster, politicians attempted to pander to voters' perceptions of who can afford to pay more tax, whilst also having to confront reality. Let's take a look at who pays what when it comes to income tax.
This is the total amount raised in income tax last year. So how much do those on the lowest 10% of incomes contribute to that? That's people whose incomes are up to about £10,000 a year. That's going to include part-time workers, some pensioners and students. That group contributes just 0.5% of the income tax total. In fact, the first 90% of income tax earners contribute less than half of all the income tax collected. This means that all of the rest is paid for by the top 10% of earners alone. That's those earning more than £48,000 a year, people like police inspectors and some senior teachers and the like. What about the richest 1%? Now, if you include not just salary, but income from savings and shares and other assets, we're talking people earning more than £153,000 a year. And that top 1%, just over 300,000 people, pays around 27% of all the income tax. That is a consequence of growing inequality. As the rich earn more and more, they pay a greater and greater share of income tax. More than enough, they may think, but others say, not nearly enough.
After 30 years in which income tax rates only went down, it's not been easy for politicians, whatever their instincts, to put it back up. It wasn't until the global financial crisis of 2008 that raising the top rate of tax got back on the agenda.
Even when the banks were crashing round our ears, when the taxpayer was shelling out for them, when anger about bankers' bonuses was at its height, a Labour government, led by Gordon Brown, 2 decades after Nigel Lawson's budget, still agonised about whether it could get away with increasing the top rate of tax.
But the crash had blown a vast hole in public finances, which had to be plugged with tax rises and spending cuts. Anyone earning over £150,000 a year would pay the new top rate of income tax.
In order to help pay for additional support for people now and to invest in the future, I've decided that the new rate will be 50% and will come in from April next year, a year earlier.
The Chancellor considered promising that it was a temporary tax rise, but that's what they'd said when income tax began. Ever since, there have been loud calls to scrap the 50p rate.
The debate about how much to tax the incomes of the rich is now not really focused on how much money can be raised, but what it says about Britain. Those who want to keep the top rate of tax at 50p argue it's a symbol of fairness, of shared pain in difficult times. Those who want to see it gone say that the rate acts as a kind of warning sign over Britain, over London, saying to the wealthy, you're not welcome here. That's a fear shared even by the man who introduced that new top rate. And he fears something else too, that it suggests that Labour is still a high tax party. Was it crossing a Rubicon?
Yes, it was. I felt it was crossing a Rubicon because it was changing our whole philosophy as New Labour. Was a different economic approach, that we were to encourage people, encourage aspiration. That meant to have a competitive tax rate, something that was realistic, to encourage people to get on. It was sending a broader political signal, if you like. Now, this was changing it.
If putting it up was difficult for Labour, cutting it now is a headache for the coalition. Liberal Democrat David Laws was George Osborne's deputy at the Treasury. The politics now makes keeping the top rate much easier than scrapping it.
I think that 50% is too high. Half of somebody's income is a hell of a lot for we in government, for the state to take, however rich they are. But I'm absolutely clear that while we are in the middle of this necessary process of government austerity, while we're imposing huge burdens on people across society, it would be absolutely nuts to be seen to be a government that was prioritising the richest 1% of the population.
The rich aren't exactly lining up to offer to pay more tax on their income. To many, having to hand over more than half what they earn to the government crosses a psychological pain barrier. So politicians faced with the political, with the practical difficulties of getting more money that way have turned increasingly not to the rich, but to the, well, comfortably off.
I'm heading to the seaside town of Southport in Lancashire. I'm going to meet a family classified as comfortably off, wealthy enough to pay not the top rate of tax, but the so-called higher rate, 40 pence in the pound, levied on earnings over £44,000 a year. Kat Sumner earns nothing. She's a full-time mum, bringing up 4 children. Although her husband Neil earns about £49,000 a year, they feel far from comfortable. In fact, they feel stretched.
Some people will hear 49,000 and think, that's a lot of money. That's a lot more than we earn.
Yeah, and I understand that. I understand how people feel about that. But, I mean, I don't think they really understand how far that really goes when you've got to think about 6 people paying for their food, paying for their clothes, housing them all. I have to try quite hard to make ends meet.
Instead of putting up tax rates, politicians have classified more and more people as higher rate taxpayers, dragging more families into the net. The number of families like Kat's paying 40% has trebled in the past 30 years.
Don't know now. The tax bandings are have been very static compared to people's incomes. As people's incomes rose and rose, the tax bandings stayed pretty much where they were, and therefore brought more people into paying 40% tax rate. That whole situation is really unfair.
With so many ordinary families now paying the higher rate of tax, it's become even harder for politicians to increase their tax rate. Instead, the government's forced to claw back cash from them in other ways.
we will withdraw child benefit from households with a higher rate taxpayer. When the debts left by Labour threaten our economy, when our welfare costs are out of control, this measure makes sense.
It's my only income as a person, and when it was taken away, it made me feel really like, you know, this is us saying there is no value in what you do. We don't value anything about you, who you are, or what you do.
The plan to cut Kat's child benefit inspired her to start a local campaign against the cuts.
I've got a few things here explaining about some of the cuts that are being made, and then there's next.
She wants the better off to pay more, and certainly doesn't think of herself as belonging to that group.
Start classing people who have wheelchairs.
In terms of tax, you don't want to pay any more.
It's not that I don't want to pay any more. I feel that people should be responsible and take pride in paying their taxes, but I feel like we haven't got any more to give.
That feeling, which many people share, is what tempts politicians to promise tax cuts, even when there simply isn't the money to pay for them. There are now 3 million higher rate taxpayers, but 10 times that number pay the basic rate, so cutting that has long been the holy grail.
The idea of cutting income tax has held politicians, whether Conservative or Labour, in its spell for 3 decades. When Gordon Brown delivered his last budget just weeks before moving next door on Downing Street to number 10, he was determined to prove that he too was a new Labour figure. What better way of doing that than cutting the basic rate of income tax? And you know, for a while, it all seemed to go so well.
To reward work, to ensure working families are better off, and to make the tax system fairer, I will from next April cut the basic rate of income tax from 22 pence to 20 pence.
But, you know, everybody, you know, likes to sit down to a cheer. But, you know, this is a case where if you're going to change the tax system in a big way, for goodness sake, ask yourself, you know, is this too good to be true?
I commend this budget to the House.
Because the answer is, yeah, it probably is too good to be true.
Problem for David Cameron to follow this, which he'll be doing in a moment?
Dire, he said that it was worse than changing nappies. A Labour Chancellor, who they've said is a tax increaser, has suddenly, with about 30-second notice, said, there, a 2p cut on income tax. He doesn't know what we don't know. Who is paying for that 2p cut in the basic rate? We'll find out. What we did find out is that that income tax cut for some was being paid for by an income tax rise for some of the poorest taxpayers in the country. Gordon Brown had scrapped the lowest level of income tax, the 10p band. And he, like another Labour Chancellor, Dennis Healey, all those years ago, was greeted with howls of outrage. The problem this time is they were coming from his own supporters.
I'm afraid the real problem for us was there was an awful lot of people who bluntly were traditional Labour voters and certainly been with us you know, in support for the last 10 years, who suddenly found their income had dropped. And they're the ones who said, hold on, what have you done to us?
When Alistair Darling took over from Brown at the Treasury, he also took over the daunting problem of compensating those who'd paid the price for a good headline.
At a cost of £2.7 billion, I will increase the individual personal tax allowances by £600 to £6,000.
The eventual bill was closer to £6 billion, and it was politically costly too. Just 8 days after Darling's attempted salvage job, Labour lost a once-safe seat in a by-election in Crewe and Nantwich.
20,539.
This was not well managed at all. This was a political disaster, and it took a heavy toll.
The reality is that the biggest money spinner of all, income tax, has now become a dead-cert political loser.
The political consensus that it was impossible to raise income tax meant that government simply couldn't raise enough money that way. There was, of course, a simple solution: tax people's incomes, but do it with a tax called something different. National insurance.
The government takes not only income tax from our pay packets, but also national insurance, which of course is paid by employers too.
Is wise venture a wise venture?
It's hard to keep track of how much we cough up, let alone where it goes.
Thanks very much indeed.
So, with some punters, I did a few sums.
How much income tax do you think you pay?
2,000? 3,000? Oh my God!
How much do you think you pay in national insurance?
2,500?
2,500.
Wow. I need a pay rise.
Would you like to pay more tax, Kirsty?
No, I wouldn't actually.
You wouldn't?
No.
But if you had to have a tax rise, which would you rather it was income tax or national insurance?
I would prefer that it was national insurance.
Because?
Because I believe in the national health system, and I think it's far better to pay into that.
I think if they had to put one up, I'd prefer it to be national insurance.
Because?
Because I think that goes towards healthcare and things that I will need in the future.
So if they're going to put anything up, put up the national insurance. If I told you they're absolutely the same, income tax and national insurance, they pay for exactly the same things.
No, that's just like wrong.
They do. Many of us may think that national insurance is not just another tax, but some kind of, well, insurance, paying exclusively for health and pensions. That was true once, now it's a fiction. Yet it's one which serves politicians well to maintain.
At the top, Mr. Brown, please.
In the budget of 2002, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor who'd pledged not to raise income tax, raised the tax on our incomes by putting up national insurance. The clever bit was the way he sold it to us.
We as a nation will have to spend more on health care. I believe it is right that when everyone, employees and employers, benefit from the insurance provided by the National Health Service, everyone who can should make a fair contribution.
Market researcher Deborah Mattinson had tested every key phrase in focus groups. Her job was to find a way to sell Gordon Brown's tax rise.
First off, it was about ring-fencing the money and saying this will go on the NHS, and that the NHS needed more investment, which people bought relatively easily, and it resulted in a tax rise that 8 out of 10 people supported and were in favour of, which I think is quite an achievement.
So finally someone had done it, come up with a popular tax rise. How did Gordon Brown do it? Well, first and foremost, by not calling it an income tax rise. Second, by making it seem to be for a very specific purpose. And thirdly, by linking it with the national religion, the NHS. But there's a sting in this tale. If the government thought it would get the credit for the spending produced by that tax rise, it was to be mistaken.
What we found, very frustratingly, was what we began to describe as I've been lucky syndrome. So people would say, you know, my local primary school is okay, but I've been lucky. Or I took my daughter to the A&E, we were seen in half an hour, but we were lucky. So in other words, when they started to see that change in their own lives, they didn't assume that this was happening all over the country.
And does that have an impact of undermining the ability of politicians to ask for more money to spend?
It completely undermined the ability, because basically people didn't feel that things had improved. What had happened to them, their experience, what they'd seen, was an isolated lucky fluke. I've been lucky.
And this could be one of the biggest problems of all for politicians trying to raise more tax on our incomes. Whatever the evidence, we never seem to think we're getting a bargain.
How much do we get back in return for the taxes that we give to the government? Well, that depends, of course, on where we are on the income scale. Let's put all the households in the UK into 10 equal groups, starting with the poorest and moving up to the richest. This shows what households on average get from government. The higher the bar, the more the group gets in things like healthcare, education, pensions and benefits, pretty much everything the government spends its money on. As we go down the income scale towards the poorest, we see that on average poorer households get slightly more from the government. No surprise there, because of course they get more in terms of benefits. But now let's add something. Let's see what happens when you add in how much people pay in tax. Above the line is what you're getting from the government, below the line is what you're paying to them in taxes. For the first 6 groups, that's for 60% of all households. On average, they are getting more back than they're paying in. But then look at the top 40% of households. On average, they are getting less than they pay. And this last one, the top, the richest 10%, they contribute on average about 5 times in tax more than they are getting back. There is a further twist, though, which makes life even harder for politicians. Opinion polls show that even people in those groups that do receive the most don't see it that way. They tell pollsters they simply don't believe that they're getting more back than they've paid in.
If taxing people's incomes is hard to sell, what about taxing the things we buy instead? Leicester is home to one of the biggest markets in Europe. Plenty here, you might think, for a chancellor to take a bite of. If only it were that simple.
There is a tax that we all pay almost every day and yet often barely notice it. It's a tax that generates a vast amount of revenue and can generate a vast amount of political controversy. It operates in a pretty bizarre way, and yet any politician who tries to sort that out ends up with a bloody nose.
It's nearly 40 years since the Chancellor of the Exchequer introduced VAT, value-added tax. You paid 10% on everything, except the essentials, food and children's clothes. He called it a simple tax. How times change. Take pet food.
I'll take those if I may, please.
Oh, yes, sir.
Now, has that got VAT with it?
Yes, it has.
What, you paid VAT on these?
Yeah.
Really?
Terrible, isn't it? Now, if it was a bag of rabbit food, then there's no VAT on it because we eat rabbits, but our dogs are pets, so you're charged.
There's no VAT on rabbit food?
On rabbit
But there is on dog
food.
food?
Yeah. If you buy some biscuits in the supermarket for you, then there's no VAT on it, but dog biscuits you charge VAT on.
So if I gave my dog chocolate chip cookies?
Yeah, no VAT.
No VAT. But if I give my dog these? What hasn't got VAT? What can I feed my dog that hasn't got
A bag of
VAT?
rabbit food, sorry.
Right, where is it?
There's no VAT on
What
that.
do you think the dog would eat that?
There's no VAT on wild birds.
No VAT on those, right,
But
okay.
if you have the cockatiel seed,
Yes.
because it's got some seed in and some of them, then that's vatable because it's for a specific animal.
Are you a tax accountant?
No, I have to split it all for me accounts.
Does it make any sense?
No.
Clearly time for me to do some homework. The once simple rules on what is and is not vatable now run to almost 3,500 pages. Even the stallholders seem confused.
What about tea?
Yes, I think yes.
No, you don't pay VAT on that. But if I go and buy a cup of tea over there, I do pay VAT on that. Jaffa cakes. VAT? No VAT.
No.
Now, what about popcorn? VAT or not VAT? And the right answer is no.
I said that in the first place.
That one doesn't pay. That one does pay VAT.
Why?
Don't ask me, I'm not the Chancellor.
It's as clear as mud, isn't it? It really, really is.
With all this confusion and complexity, it might seem straightforward, sensible even, for politicians to simplify things and add VAT to more goods, raising a few quid as they do. Well, not quite. Takeaways used to be tax-free until back in 1984 the then Tory government decided to extend VAT to cover them. Logical, painless, or so they thought.
Restaurants' meals were subject to VAT
But takeaway food was not subject to VAT. If you sat down and had a meal, you were paying VAT. If you took the thing away as a takeaway, you weren't. So I thought that's ridiculous. So I said, well, we'll put VAT on takeaway meals as well.
But some political heavyweights found that hard to swallow.
It's diabolical. This is a tax on the customer. It's a tax on the consumer. It's 15% on the price of food for a lot of pensioners, a lot of students, a lot of school children, a lot of unemployed, and a lot of people with large families who go out to work and rely on hot takeaways such as fish and chips and so on.
As well as that battering, there was a problem with the men at the revenue.
Well, then the Customs and Excise said to me, well, look, this is very difficult to draw a line, because some takeaway foods, for example, a salad, is very much like going to the grocers and getting it there, and you don't have to pay VAT there. And how do we draw the line between groceries and takeaway food? So I came to the absurd conclusion, but it has stuck ever since, and it is the law, that I would say if it was hot, you paid VAT, and if it's cold, you don't.
For 30 years, it has been Tory chancellors who've extended VAT and hiked the rate, whilst Labour politicians have condemned them for taxing the poor.
But under Gordon Brown, a battle raged, not between the parties, but within his government. He was desperate not to put VAT up, but his chancellor living next door was desperate to do just that.
Desperate because boom had turned to bust. The City of London and the housing market, which had provided so much of the cash which the Treasury had depended on, had crashed. The man responsible for balancing the books had already raised the top rate of income tax. Now he wanted to do precisely what his party had spent decades attacking the Tories for doing.
What I wanted to do was to gradually increase VAT up to 19 or 20%. That would have allowed me to have cut personal taxes, taken more people out of tax, and critically, not only could I have compensated the people on fixed incomes who otherwise would lose out with that, I could also make a sizable inroad into cutting our borrowing.
Nick Pearce worked at the time as a senior aide to Gordon Brown. He recalls how the Prime Minister and his team thought a VAT rise would be seen as penalising the poor, and a massive political U-turn.
People in number 10 thought, look, that's not a fair tax, it's a regressive tax, it will split the Labour Party potentially, and it blunts the sort of sense that Labour has responded to the crisis with fairness, because it's quite hard to argue that VAT is a fair tax.
Alistair Darling was told that a VAT rise would hand the election to the Tories. He was ordered to increase national insurance instead. This time, though, the policy backfired.
You could make a case for national insurance. Yes, you can. But it was going to be portrayed as a tax on jobs. And, surprise, surprise, that's exactly what happened the first week of the election campaign in 2010.
How frustrating was this argument?
Well, it's always frustrating, but, I'm not the first Chancellor to clash or to find it frustrating with my next-door neighbour. In fact, as far as I can see, most Chancellors, sooner or later, it's one of these things, it's a doomed relationship when you move in together.
Even more frustrating must have been the sight of his Tory successor, George Osborne, doing exactly what Darling had wanted to do, raising VAT to 20%.
The years of debt and spending make this unavoidable.
Unavoidable, he says, but before the election, it had been unmentionable.
The Conservatives hadn't gone to the electorate to say that they were thinking of putting up VAT. There again, Labour ministers had not told voters that they were thinking of doing precisely the same thing. It all goes to show that politicians find it very, very difficult to be up front with the public about putting up tax.
For government after government, raising enough tax to cover their spending has been a political nightmare. But people who take to the streets have no such worries. Their answer is to get more tax from those who are avoiding it, especially the banks and big business.
At the end of the day, the people who caused the crisis are getting away without paying for it. And the people that I see in my community living in the shadow of these banks, we're suffering, we're having our services cut.
We've really got to challenge this idea that businesses somehow are constrained by paying tax. The idea that they should get away from their tax means other people have to pay that tax for them.
A growing number believe that bankers and those they see as greedy businessmen are getting away with avoiding what they really owe. And the taxman is seen as being a mere amateur compared with the professional tax avoiders of the corporate world.
Big companies have one advantage over all the rest of us. They can make their affairs really, really complicated. And because they can, they become really difficult to understand. And that means the job of collecting tax from them is quite hard because no one quite knows the truth. And as a consequence, they pay less tax than you do, I do, and most people watching this programme will pay. Cowardly politicians have put us into this situation, and we now need some courageous ones to get us out of it.
Of both parties?
Of both parties. Of all parties.
For many centuries, the authorities have come up with more and more ingenious ways to get their hands on our money, and taxpayers have found ways to avoid paying it. Now, if you don't give the revenue what you owe them, that's illegal, that's tax evasion. But if you do your best to give them as little as possible, that's perfectly legal. That's called tax avoidance.
These days, tax-avoiding wheezes are often hidden deep in company accounts. But our past efforts are everywhere to be seen.
This building in Westminster was built just a few years after the imposition of the hated windows tax. In the early 1700s, the idea of taxing our incomes was unthinkable. The way it worked was simple. If you had a building and it had windows, you owed the government 2 shillings a year. If it had more than 10 windows, it was 4 shillings, more than 20, 8 shillings, which is why buildings were often built with the windows bricked up. The only way to avoid what we call these days daylight robbery.
Down Coronation Street, avoiding tax is what you do when you pay the plumber in cash. But the programme vividly shows how politicians themselves can make avoidance easier by making the tax system too complex.
I think a classic example is the mess that Gordon Brown got into when he was Chancellor a few years ago, when he introduced a very well-meaning new tax relief designed to encourage filmmakers to come to the United Kingdom and make all their films over here. And we suddenly had allegedly Coronation Street and all sorts of comedy programmes made by independent producers being classified as films and enjoying the value of this tax relief.
Somebody tell me what the hell's going on!
And by the time the Treasury had figured out what was going on, a tax relief that was supposed to be costing the Exchequer 20 or 30 million pounds a year was beginning to cost 200, 300, 400 million pounds. So a massive, massive loss to the taxpayer.
So tax avoidance created by a well-meaning Chancellor?
This was tax avoidance on an industrial scale, created precisely by the government, not thinking through the consequences of the measures it was taking and not putting in place the protection necessary to make sure this tax allowance didn't grow out of control.
Both businesses and individuals exploit the complexity of our tax system. Billionaire John Caldwell was branded a tax avoider a few years back. He was paying himself and his executives via a tax-free trust in Jersey and had to refund the Exchequer millions of pounds. Those words, tax avoider, how do you feel when you hear them?
Well, avoidance still doesn't sound great, does it? But all it really means is somebody legally minimising their tax liability. And you tell me what grown up in the UK who's paying tax wouldn't like to minimise the tax through whatever means they can.
John Caldwell has now paid a fortune in taxes, but he says avoidance is simple for people like him.
You know, there's so many of my friends that have done tax planning by leaving the country, and the country's so much the poorer for it.
Some people say that taxes are, for the very rich, effectively voluntary.
I think taxes are totally voluntary for the very rich. You know, we all have the freedom of choice to leave the country, to go to a tax-free state and end up selling your business or generating income and doing it in a virtually tax-free environment.
If you're rich and you want to avoid paying tax, you can move yourself or your business abroad. There is one thing, of course, that is very hard to move abroad: your house. Which is why there's now growing pressure for a so-called mansions tax on expensive property. Here in London's Mayfair, there should be scope for quite a haul for the Chancellor. Even a rather modest-looking place down this street has been on the market for £20 million. That's right, 20 million.
Here we go, Nick. We've arrived.
Looks very different inside from outside.
It does.
Estate agent Liam Bailey gave me a tour.
Open plan, ready to move into. And this market really, the buyers for this type of property, what they're looking for is a property which is absolutely finished before they move in.
So almost like having a hotel room, you sort of come in and you can use it.
Exactly right.
Some say that a tax on expensive property offers a way of getting the very rich to stump up more. And there's another argument too. It turns out that the people who can afford places like this can pay a lot less tax on their purchases than most ordinary mortals.
If I was buying this, stamp duty would be a bit of a worry if I even had the money.
Well, it'd be 5%, so you'd be paying £1 million in stamp duty.
And can I avoid that?
You could buy potentially through an offshore company structure, and effectively you'd be paying 0.5%.
So I'm saving
£900,000.
Rich foreign buyers can also escape having to pay capital gains tax when they sell up. And council tax isn't much of a worry either.
Well, this would be banded, band H, the top band, so you'd be paying the maximum council tax in the area.
Which is the same for this 20 million or more house as it is for some £500,000 flat down the road.
Could be.
For politicians who see pitfalls in other taxes, raising money from expensive property may sound a surefire winner. But hold on, have you forgotten the fuss created by other property taxes, like the rates?
Would a property tax be an easy and politically pain-free way of raising a large sum of money?
There is an economic rationale for a property tax, beyond doubt. In my view, it would be political suicide for anybody to do it. The British are attached to housing. They see housing as a source of wealth. Of course, a lot of it is inflation and is due to the scarcity of housing. It's not productive wealth in that sense. But I think a property tax would be political madness.
I think that wealth and land taxes tend to be ones that are very popular with economists, and they tend to be less popular with politicians. And that's because people often don't like the idea of being taxed on things that they have already purchased out of income which has been taxed. And of course people don't like new taxes in general.
The tighter the squeeze gets on us all, the more pressure government will be under to raise taxes on the sorts of people who can afford houses like this. And if they say, look, we're ready to move abroad, there'll be plenty of people who say either good riddance or it's just an idle threat. But the dilemma that politicians will face is the same as we've seen before. If you want to really raise money on the rich, you'll end up hitting people who regard themselves as not rich at all. Which, of course, takes us back precisely to where we started. In this series, we've seen how politicians, urged on by us, have been spending more and more and more for decades. Now that the economic clouds have become darker, the sums no longer add up. We voters have begrudged giving politicians the extra tax needed to pay for it all. Do you resent sometimes your taxes going from you to someone else?
I've resented it all my life, yeah.
The rich don't want to pay more.
So many of my friends and acquaintances have done tax planning by leaving the country.
And the rest of us seem to think we pay quite enough already.
I have to try quite hard to make ends meet.
And when politicians try other wheezes to raise tax, they get into trouble.
It's as clear as mud, isn't it? It really, really is.
They say they simply can't win.
If someone can think of a popular tax, then they should phone up and let us know, because it isn't obvious there is one.
But curiously, the current economic crisis may force us to confront head-on our troubles with tax.
Governments keep on changing and tweaking the existing system, creating things that are more and more complex and irrational. Perhaps, once, twice, 3 times in every century, there is a fundamental opportunity to do something more radical, to clear away all the debris that's built up from decades of incremental government policy. But if we don't make some of these big changes now, the opportunity to do so again may not come for another 20, 30 years.
For years, any politician living on this street who's dared to admit they might need to tax us a bit more and spend a little bit less has found themselves punished. No wonder then that whether they're Labour or Conservative, they've tended to pretend that they can spend more and more and yet tax less and less. If there's one advantage of the current economic crisis, perhaps it's